My brother laughed the first time the judge said my name. Not a nervous laugh, not one of those quick sounds people make when they are uncomfortable and trying to fill the air, but a loud, rolling, satisfied laugh that bounced against the old wooden benches of the county courtroom and made three people in the gallery turn around. Rain tapped at the windows behind Judge Elaine Porter. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere in the back, a deputy shifted his weight and the leather of his belt creaked. I stood alone at the defense table in a beige raincoat that still smelled faintly of cedar from my hall closet, holding one plain leather folder against my ribs. Across the aisle, my younger brother Caleb sat with an attorney in a navy suit that probably cost more than my first used car. Behind him, in the second row, our father sat with his hands folded on the head of his cane. Arthur Reed was 86 years old, proud, stubborn, and still broad across the shoulders despite age carving him down bone by bone. He was not sitting behind me. That was the first betrayal the courtroom could see, even if nobody understood it yet. My father had chosen a bench, and the bench he chose was behind my brother. He would later tell me he did not think of it that way. He would say Caleb had driven him there. Caleb had helped him through security. Caleb had steadied his elbow when the slick courthouse steps nearly took his balance. And by the time they reached the courtroom, he simply followed the son who had brought him. Maybe that was true in the small, practical way old men explain away emotional choices. But to me, standing alone in front of strangers while my brother accused me of stealing from our dead mother, every inch between my father and me felt measured. The aisle was not wide. It was maybe 5 feet across. But that morning, it held 40 years. Judge Porter looked over the file, adjusted the glasses low on her nose, and said, "Miss Evelyn Reed, the court understands you are appearing without counsel today. Is that correct?" Before I could answer, Caleb leaned back and laughed. He wore a gray sport coat and a maroon tie, the kind of tie a man wears when he wants to look wounded but respectable. "She can't afford a lawyer, Your Honor," he said loudly, as if he were doing the room a favor by explaining my poverty. "That's why she's here pretending paperwork makes her dangerous." A few people chuckled. One of our cousins, Darlene, whispered something behind her hand. I heard the word house. I did not look at her. I looked at Caleb. He had the same smug tilt to his mouth he used when we were children, and he had hidden something of mine, waiting for me to cry so he could call me dramatic. Judge Porter did not laugh. Her eyes moved from Caleb to his attorney, Martin Keene, and Mr. Keene immediately put a hand on Caleb's sleeve. "My client apologizes, Your Honor," he said. Caleb did not look sorry. He looked pleased that his lawyer had made his rudeness sound like strategy. The judge turned back to me. "Ms. Reed, do you understand the seriousness of this matter?" she asked. "Yes, Your Honor," I said. My voice sounded smaller than I liked. Not weak exactly, but quiet in the way voices become when the room expects them to fail. The complaint alleged that I had manipulated my mother, Rose Reed, during her final months, that I had taken advantage of confusion caused by age and illness, that I had interfered with estate assets, and that I had attempted to cut Caleb out of what he called his rightful inheritance. It accused me of being absent for decades and then appearing when property became valuable. It made grief sound like opportunity and love sound like a transaction. Caleb wanted the court to see me as a greedy older sister who had drifted back to Virginia after widowhood and found a house worth fighting over. He wanted everyone to forget the years when I sent money without telling my father, the months when I sat in airports after classified briefings and called home from payphones, the holidays I missed because duty was not a flexible thing, and the quiet ways I had tried to help after my mother's health began to break. He wanted the simple story because simple stories are easy to sell. Caleb stayed. Evelyn left. Caleb cared. Evelyn abandoned. Caleb knew how powerful that story was, especially with my father sitting behind him like a witness exhibit. Mr. Keene rose first. He was polished, silver-haired, late 50s, with the calm confidence of a man who had spent his adult life translating other people's messes into billable hours. He spoke about loyalty, caregiving, proximity, and a son's burden. He described Caleb as the child who remained in town, who handled medical appointments, bills, errands, pharmacy pickups, and the emotional labor of aging parents. I almost smiled at that phrase because I doubted Caleb had used the words emotional labor before his attorney taught them to him. Mr. Keene said my return had coincided with several material changes in estate planning, a polished way of implying I had slithered in during weakness. He said my professional past made me comfortable with administrative pressure. That was the first time his argument touched the truth by accident. I kept my hands folded on the table. I listened. I watched the way Caleb nodded at every sentence that made him look noble. I watched Arthur's fingers tremble slightly against the cane. I watched the order of Mr. Keene's folders, the tabs, the dates visible on the top copies when he shifted them. I did what I had learned to do over decades. Let people reveal the architecture of their lie before asking them to explain the foundation. People think silence means fear. More often, silence is measurement. When Mr. Keene said, "Miss Reed's long absence from the family home is not merely emotional context, Your Honor, it is evidence of motive," I took off my raincoat. I folded it once, then again, and placed it over the back of my chair. The motion was slow enough that even Caleb stopped smirking. I opened my leather folder but did not remove anything. Instead, I looked at Mr. Keene and asked, "Mr. Keene, who signed your security clearance?" The room did not go quiet. It went still. There is a difference. Quiet means sound has stopped. Still means people are afraid to disturb what just happened. Mr. Keene's expression changed before he could stop it. Color drained from his face, not dramatically, not like the movies, but enough that the judge noticed. His hand hovered over the folder he had been about to open. He knew that question. More than that, he knew people did not ask it casually. Caleb laughed again, but this time the laugh had confusion inside it. "What does that even mean?" he said. "Evelyn, are you trying to sound important?" I did not answer Caleb. I kept looking at his attorney. Mr. Keene swallowed once. His eyes narrowed as a recognition worked its way through memory. "Evelyn Reed," he said, not to the court, not to Caleb, but almost to himself. "Naval Logistics Compliance." I nodded. "Retired." Judge Porter leaned forward. "Counsel, is there something the court should know?" Mr. Keene recovered most of his face, but not all of it. "Your Honor," he said carefully, "I would request a brief recess to consult with my client." Caleb jerked his head toward him. "For what?" he whispered, loudly enough for 3 rows to hear. "She's bluffing." Mr. Keene did not answer. That silence was the first crack in Caleb's morning. A person like my brother can tolerate being opposed. He cannot tolerate being the last person in the room to understand danger. The judge granted a recess of 15 minutes. The gavel sounded softer than I expected. People stood, murmured, gathered coats and phones. Caleb bent toward Mr. Keene, his face red, one hand chopping the air. Arthur looked at me for the first time since we entered the courtroom, and I saw something pass across his face that was not trust, not yet, but uncertainty. He had believed Caleb's story because it fit an old wound. Now someone outside the family had reacted to me as if I carried weight he had never bothered to ask about. I sat down alone at the defense table while the room rearranged itself around fear. They thought I had come alone because I had no one. The truth was, I came alone because I had spent 40 years learning exactly how liars bury themselves. 3 months before that morning, I was in my kitchen overlooking a gray strip of the Chesapeake Bay, heating canned tomato soup because grief had made cooking feel theatrical. My husband Tom had been gone 4 years by then, but some evenings still carried his absence like weather. The house was small, one story, with windows that rattled during storms and a narrow porch where Tom used to drink coffee before dawn. He had been Coast Guard first, then a harbor safety inspector, and he believed the world was divided between things you could control, things you could prepare for, and things you survived by loving someone through them. He would have hated the envelope that arrived that day. Certified mail always has a particular cruelty. It asks for your signature before it tells you the shape of the wound. I signed. I made soup. I let the envelope sit on the table while steam fogged the window above the sink. Then I opened it with the butter knife Tom had once used to pry a jam drawer back into working order. The complaint was thicker than it needed to be. Lawyers like paper because paper gives accusation a spine. I read my brother's name first. Caleb Reed, petitioner, then mine. Evelyn Reed, respondent. Then our mother's name, Rose, printed and reprinted until she stopped sounding like a woman who smelled of lemon lotion and became an estate interest. By the 3rd page, I understood the allegation. By the 10th page, I understood the plan. By the last page, I understood my father had supported it. My hands did not shake immediately. People imagine shock as a dramatic thing, but real shock is orderly. I stacked the pages. I read them again. I underlined dates that did not match my memory. I circled phrases like undue influence and cognitive decline. I wrote a question mark beside pattern of financial opportunism. Then I stood up, poured the soup down the sink, rinsed the pan, dried it, and placed it back in the cabinet. Only after the kitchen was clean did my hands begin to shake. They shook so hard I had to sit down. Caleb had been a beautiful baby. That was my first thought after the legal language lost its first sting. He had been round-cheeked, dark-eyed, furious when hungry, and always reaching for whatever I held. I was 5 years older, which, in childhood, meant I was half sister, half deputy parent. Our mother worked late at the county records office when we were little, and our father took overtime at the shipyard whenever he could get it. I changed Caleb's diapers before I fully understood what responsibility was. I walked him to school when he was frightened of a boy named Eddie Pruitt. I lied for him when he threw a baseball through Mrs. Hanley's storm window, when he was 17 and backed our father's truck into a drainage ditch after sneaking out. I told Arthur I had borrowed it because I knew Dad's disappointment would crush Caleb more than punishment. That was the brother who now claimed I had targeted our mother. That was the boy who once crawled into my bed during thunderstorms, now asking a court to believe I had preyed on Rose as she weakened. It is strange how betrayal reorders memory. You revisit every kindness not because you regret it, but because you wonder when the person receiving it began saving it as evidence of your foolishness. The deeper injury was not Caleb's signature on the complaint. It was my father's presence behind it. Arthur Reed had never forgiven me for leaving. He loved me, I think, in the private, stubborn way some fathers love daughters they do not understand. But he loved through expectation. And when expectation failed, he called it principle. In 1979, when I joined the Navy, He acted as if I had enlisted against him personally. He believed daughters stayed close. Sons might chase jobs, wars, weather, or mistakes, but daughters were supposed to remain within reach of family need. My mother understood before I did that staying would have made me resentful and small. Rose had kissed me at the bus station and tucked $20 into my palm. Arthur shook my hand as if I were a man he had agreed not to fight in public. Over the years, the family built a story around my absence because stories keep people from having to ask complicated questions. Caleb was the good son because he was there. He was there when Dad needed the gutters cleaned. He was there when Mom's car needed inspection. He was there at cookouts, birthdays, and church suppers. I was the voice on the phone saying I could not discuss where I was or when I would be back. I miss Thanksgivings because of deployments, Christmas mornings because of logistics failures halfway around the world, and birthdays because the government does not rearrange classified schedules around cake. Nobody saw the cost of that. They only saw the empty chair. Caleb's life, by contrast, was visible. It was also a long series of collapses with explanations attached. First came the boat repair business, which failed because his partner didn't understand local customers. Then the landscaping company, which failed because fuel prices rose. Then used RV sales, a marina proposal, a vending machine route, a scheme involving imported engine parts, and several investments that were always almost profitable until someone else ruined them. Caleb never failed in his own telling. He was failed by partners, banks, timing, regulations, weather, and family members who did not support him enough. Arthur forgave every loss because Caleb remained within driving distance. Proximity became proof of devotion, and devotion became credit he spent freely. I sent money more times than I admitted. 1,000 here when Mom said Caleb was in a rough patch. 3,000 when Dad mentioned a business tax problem without calling it that. 500 in cash tucked into Rose's birthday card because she sounded tired and said groceries were getting silly. I never called the loans what they were. I never asked Caleb to repay me after the first 2 times he promised and did not. Tom noticed, of course. Tom noticed everything. He once stood in our kitchen in Norfolk drying a plate and said, "Evie, people only respect sacrifice when they can see the blood." I told him that was cynical. He kissed my forehead and said, "No, sweetheart. It's maritime law. If the wreck is underwater, everybody argues about whether it happened." Tom understood silence because he had lived under his own. He had served in the Coast Guard, then inspected harbor operations where one missed safety step could kill a man before lunch. We met in Norfolk at a retirement ceremony for someone neither of us particularly liked. He had a scar along his jaw from a rescue that went badly, and a laugh that arrived half a second before his smile. He never asked me to explain what I could not explain. When I came home after weeks away and sat in the dark because language felt too noisy, he brought tea, sat beside me, and waited. After he died of pancreatic cancer, the world became too loud. I retired from the last consulting work I had kept out of habit and moved back toward Virginia water, thinking perhaps age had softened old resentments. I was wrong. Age had not softened them. It had preserved them. When Rose's health began to fail, I tried to return carefully. I brought groceries. I offered to take her to appointments. I asked Dad what needed fixing around the house. Caleb was always there, leaning in doorways, answering questions not addressed to him. "Mom's tired. Dad gets confused when too many people talk at once. I've got the bills handled. She doesn't need visitors today." He used the language of care like a fence. If I pushed, Arthur frowned and said, Your brother has been handling things. If I offered to help anyway, Caleb sighed as if I had arrived late to criticize the person who had done all the work. I remember one afternoon in particular. Rose sat in her recliner with a quilt over her knees, thinner than I wanted to admit, her hair soft and white against the blue cushion. I had brought chicken soup from a place she liked in Gloucester. Caleb took the bag from me before I reached the kitchen. "She can't have too much salt," he said. Rose looked at me, then at him. Her mouth tightened, but she said nothing. Arthur was in the den with the television too loud. I tried to ask Mom whether she wanted me to look at her pharmacy list, and Caleb laughed. "Since when did you become Family Medical Command?" he said. Rose flinched at the word command. That was when I first understood that my service, the thing Arthur resented and Caleb mocked, had become a weapon they could use to make ordinary concern sound like control. Caleb's hatred had old roots, though I did not want to see how deep they had gone. He hated the Navy photograph Mom kept on the hallway table, the one of me at 32 with my hair pulled tight and my face too serious. He once turned it face down during a barbecue and claimed it had fallen. He mocked my certificates, my retirement plaque, even the careful way I kept documents in labeled folders. "Some of us didn't need uniforms to prove we mattered," he told me once after too many beers. At the time, I heard insecurity. Later, I understood it as rehearsal. Caleb wanted more than money. He wanted the family record rewritten so completely that my competence became arrogance, my absence became betrayal, and his closeness became moral ownership. Rose saw more than any of us knew. She had always been gentle, but gentleness was not blindness. My mother could hear a lie in the pause before it arrived. She knew which neighbor drank, which church treasurer skimmed small amounts from bake sale cash, which cousin's marriage was cracking before anyone else noticed. She learned by listening, by letting loud people enjoy being underestimated. That was her gift. And near the end, she used it from a chair in a room Caleb believed he controlled. The late-night calls began about 8 months before she died. At first, I thought insomnia had made her nostalgic. My phone would ring close to 11, sometimes after midnight, and Rose would say, "Did I wake you, honey?" in a whisper that told me she was not alone or did not want to be overheard. She asked about weather, Tom's old roses, whether I still kept the red kettle, whether the bay smelled like salt after rain. Then the questions changed. "Can property taxes double in 1 year?" she asked once. Another night, "If a bank changes loan terms, shouldn't both spouses receive the paperwork?" Another time, "If somebody helps with bills, should they keep all the statements?" I sat up straighter every time. Rose had balanced checkbooks to the penny since before I could read. She knew the answer to those questions. She was asking whether I knew she was afraid. "Mom," I said one night, "is Caleb taking over the accounts?" There was silence long enough for me to hear the faint hum of her oxygen machine. Then she said, "Your brother is under pressure." That is not an answer. She sighed, and the sound was so tired it made me close my eyes. You always did hear the shape of things. Before I could press her, a door opened on her end. Her voice changed immediately. "All right, sweetheart, I'll let you sleep." Caleb's voice came faintly, cheerful and sharp. "Mom, who are you talking to?" The line went dead. Whenever I visited after that, Caleb had already staged the room. Bills were nowhere visible. Rose's phone was across the room, charging. Arthur sat in his chair watching news, irritated by any subject that required effort. Caleb answered for everyone. If I asked Rose whether she wanted more water, he said she had just had some. If I asked Arthur about the property taxes, Caleb said, "Handled." If I asked to speak to Mom privately, he said she became anxious when people questioned her. He positioned himself between concern and access. I had seen that pattern in investigations of procurement fraud, in offices where one employee insisted on helping everyone find documents, not because he was helpful, but because he needed to touch every file before anyone else did. Control rarely announces itself, it volunteers. I started with public records. That is what old investigators do when family pain begins to smell like numbers. County property tax records are not romantic, but they tell the truth without tears. The Reed House, the house my father had paid for with shipyard overtime and my mother had kept alive with thrift, had not been fully paid up for nearly 18 months. There were notices, penalties, early warnings that made my chest tighten. The property was not in immediate foreclosure, but it was close enough to humiliation that I could imagine Arthur finding out from a letter taped to the door. The amount due, with penalties, was just under $16,000. I sat at my desk, looking at the screen while rain blurred the bay into slate. Then I paid it from my own account. I did not call Arthur. I did not call Caleb. I printed the confirmation, saved the digital receipt, and placed both in a folder labeled Reed Property Taxes. I told myself I kept the receipt because I had kept receipts my entire professional life. That was true. It was not the whole truth. Some part of me knew Caleb would eventually make generosity look suspicious. Some part of me knew a person who weaponizes absence will also weaponize help. Thanksgiving was the last time we were all in the house together while Rose was alive. The dining room smelled of turkey, canned cranberry sauce, and the faint medicinal sweetness that had settled into the curtains after months of illness. Rose wore a lavender sweater and looked almost transparent. Arthur carved the turkey badly because his hands shook and he refused help. Caleb performed caregiving with the confidence of an actor who had learned his lines. He refilled Mom's glass before she asked. He mentioned doctor visits loudly enough for cousins to hear. He sighed about insurance forms. He placed a hand on Arthur's shoulder at just the right moment. Every gesture said, "Look how much I do. Look how little she does." Under the table Rose found my hand. At first I thought she wanted comfort. Then her fingers tightened around mine with surprising force. Not affection. Warning. I turned toward her, but she looked straight ahead, smiling at something Darlene was saying about pie. Caleb was telling a story about driving Dad to an appointment in heavy rain. Arthur nodded along, proud and tired. Rose squeezed once more, then released me. That squeeze stayed in my palm for months. A week later, I missed a call from her at 12:17 a.m. I had fallen asleep in Tom's old chair with a book open on my lap. When I woke at 2, the missed call was there, but no voicemail. I called back. Caleb answered. "Mom's sleeping," he said. "She didn't call you." "My phone says she did." "Then she hit something by accident. You know how confused she gets with that thing?" His voice had the smooth patience of a man explaining reality to someone unreasonable. "Let her rest, Evelyn." I wanted to drive there immediately. I did not, because midnight panic is easy to dismiss, and because Arthur had already accused me of upsetting Rose by interrogating everyone. Weeks later, when I obtained the phone records, I saw she had called 3 times that night. The longest attempt lasted 42 seconds. The voicemail was gone before I ever heard it. I will never know what she tried to say. That is one of the cruelties I have had to learn to carry without solving. Investigators believe facts can close wounds. Some can, others only identify the knife. Caleb may not have harmed our mother's body, and I have never accused him of that, but He stole a final conversation from me. There are thefts no bank statement can measure. The last private words Rose ever spoke to me came during a December visit when Caleb stepped outside to take a call and Arthur dozed in his recliner. I knelt beside Mom's chair under the excuse of adjusting her blanket. She smelled of powder, lemon lotion, and fatigue. Her hand rested on mine, light as tissue. "Evelyn," she whispered, "if things get ugly, look in the blue recipe box." I leaned closer. "What things?" Her eyes moved toward the window, toward Caleb's shadow on the porch. "Promise." "I promise," I said. She closed her eyes. Caleb came back in, laughing too loudly at whatever had been said on the phone, and the moment folded away forever. Rose died 3 months later on a cold morning in March when fog sat low over the road and the hospital lights made everyone look already ghosted. Caleb controlled the funeral arrangements with efficiency that impressed relatives who had not watched him control everything else. He chose the hymns, the flowers, the order of photographs. He placed my Navy picture nowhere, though Rose had kept it in her hallway for 30 years. At the visitation, he stood near the casket greeting people with the exhausted dignity of a widower, though he was not one. "At least some of us were here when Mom needed us," he said loudly when I passed. Darlene heard. Arthur heard. No one corrected him. I stood beside my mother's casket and looked at her hands folded over a rosary she rarely used in life, feeling grief and accusation press against me from both sides. 2 weeks after the funeral, the lawsuit arrived. Caleb did not even let the ground settle over her before turning her memory into a weapon. That night, after reading the complaint twice, I sat at my kitchen table while the bay disappeared into darkness, and I remembered Rose's whisper. The blue recipe box, if things get ugly, they had. I went to my father's house on a Wednesday morning because Caleb was usually at the marina office then, or what remained of it after his latest business failure. Arthur answered the door slowly. He looked smaller than he had at Thanksgiving. Grief had loosened his skin. Suspicion had tightened his mouth. "Caleb said we should let the lawyers handle things," he said before hello. "I'm not here about the lawsuit," I said, which was technically true and emotionally false. "I want Mom's recipe box." His face changed, softening for half a second at the mention of something ordinary. Then he looked away. "Your brother packed most of her things into the garage." The sentence hit harder than I expected. Rose Reed, who had run that house like a small kingdom of coupons, soup pots, birthday cards, and clean curtains, had been reduced to bins in a garage because Caleb needed the rooms cleared of her evidence or because grief made him efficient. I did not know which explanation hurt more. The garage smelled of dust, oil, and Christmas decorations. Plastic bins were stacked beneath shelves of paint cans and old tools. Arthur stood near the door, unwilling or unable to help. I opened boxes labeled kitchen, mom clothes, MISC, and church. In the fourth bin, under a wreath with crushed red berries, I found the blue recipe box. Its corners were worn white. Rose had bought it at a yard sale in 1968 and painted tiny daisies on the lid. I remembered pulling cookie recipes from it as a child. I remembered Caleb using the index cards as pretend money until Mom scolded him. I held it with both hands and felt, for the first time since her death, that my mother had placed something living in my care. Inside were handwritten recipes, newspaper clippings, a card for lemon pound cake stained with vanilla, and one sealed envelope tucked behind divinity fudge. On the envelope, in Rose's careful, slanted hand, were the words, "For Evelyn, if Caleb takes this to court." I sat down on an overturned bucket because my knees had stopped being theoretical. Arthur stepped closer. What is that? Something Mom left, I said. His jaw tightened. Rose was confused near the end. Sometimes, I said. Not always. He did not answer. Inside the envelope was a short handwritten letter, a list of unexplained withdrawals, a photocopy of a bank statement, a small USB drive taped behind the pound cake recipe, and a note that said, Claire Benson, ask about March 14th. For several seconds, I could not breathe properly, not because of the evidence. Evidence was familiar. It was the fact that Rose had anticipated court. She had understood Caleb might do exactly what he did, and she had chosen me as the person who would know what to do. Caleb thought he had isolated her. He had not. My mother had been building a bridge out of scraps. I did not read the whole letter in the garage. I read enough to know my mother's mind had been clear when she wrote it. Caleb is not helping the way your father thinks he is. He is frightened, angry, and desperate. I should have spoken sooner. If this reaches court, please do not let him make you look like the thief. That sentence broke me in a way the lawsuit had not. I pressed the paper against my mouth and cried without sound because Arthur was standing 3 feet away and because I had spent my life learning not to make pain available for public interpretation. Rose had believed me. Rose had known. Sometimes vindication arrives too late to comfort the person who needed to hear it, but it still changes the air. I placed the USB drive in a small evidence bag from a box I kept in my car. Old habits returned with almost merciful clarity. Label, date, source, location recovered, witness present. I wrote Arthur's name as present, though I knew he did not understand why that mattered. You always were fussy with paperwork, he muttered. Yes, I said. That is why people used to pay me. He looked at me as if he wanted to ask something, then remembered he was angry. At home, I made coffee strong enough to hold up a spoon and began with the bank statement. Patterns matter more than single numbers. A desperate person can explain one withdrawal. Patterns require architecture. There were repeated transfers from my parents' household account to an account connected to Caleb's business. Some were small enough to hide inside routine expenses. Others were large enough to leave bruises. There were cashier's checks, a payment to a property appraisal company, a withdrawal near the date of Rose's hospital admission, a legal retainer payment that made me sit back slowly. The name on the transaction matched Martin Keene's firm. Caleb might have used household funds to hire the lawyer now accusing me of taking from our mother. The arrogance of it was almost elegant. Then I found the refinance documents. They were not in Rose's envelope. They were in a folder I later found behind old insurance papers in Arthur's den, a place Caleb must have missed because it looked too boring to matter. The refinance had been executed 6 months before Rose died. The loan amount was over $200,000, tied to the family property, with Caleb listed as assisting with the transaction. Rose's signature appeared on several pages. Caleb's lawsuit claimed Rose had been mentally incompetent during that same general period. That contradiction was the hinge on which everything would swing. If Rose was competent enough to sign a refinance, Caleb's allegations about her inability to understand estate choices weakened. If she was not competent, then Caleb had used an impaired woman's signature to borrow against the family home. Either answer cut him. I studied Rose's signature under a desk lamp until my eyes watered. People think signatures are simple, but the hand remembers what the mind forgets. Rose always finished the D in Reed with a small upward hook, a little lift that made the end of her name look hopeful. The refinance pages lacked that hook in 2 places. On one page, the R was too angular. On another, the spacing between Rose and Reed felt wrong, as if copied by someone drawing a road he had seen but never walked. I could not prove forgery from instinct. Instinct is a pointer, not evidence. But I added it to the timeline. Claire Benson worked at the local bank in a brick branch near a pharmacy and a barbecue place my father loved. She was cautious when I introduced myself. Bank employees learn to be cautious for good reason. But when I mentioned March 14th, her professional expression shifted into memory. She remembered Caleb bringing Rose in. Rose had been quiet. Caleb answered most questions. Rose asked once, "Will Arthur know about this?" And Caleb said Arthur had already approved everything. Claire had felt uncomfortable. She told me that twice. "Uncomfortable is not proof," she said. "No," I agreed, "but it is often where proof begins." I asked whether she would respond to a subpoena if one came. She looked out the window for a moment, then said yes. Ruth Delaney, the part-time home care nurse, was easier to find but harder to hear. She met me in the parking lot of a diner because she did not want Caleb knowing we had spoken. Ruth had strong hands, tired eyes, and the guarded anger of someone who had seen too much family cruelty disguised as caregiving. She remembered Rose becoming anxious whenever Caleb discussed finances. She remembered Caleb taking the phone away to charge it. She remembered him saying, "If you call Evelyn, Dad will think you're confused again." Ruth had not reported it because Rose denied being afraid when asked directly, and Arthur insisted Caleb was helping. "Your mother was proud," Ruth said. "Proud people can be trapped by not wanting to look trapped." The realtor clue came from a printed email folded inside a magazine near Rose's sewing basket. Miles Carter had written a polite response to Caleb about valuation ranges for the Reed property. The date was before the lawsuit. Caleb had asked how quickly a sale could close if family objections were removed. In another message, he asked about transition options for an elderly parent who might not be able to remain in the home after liquidation. Liquidation. That word in relation to my father's house made my hands go cold. The plan was larger than inheritance. Win the lawsuit, discredit Evelyn, control Arthur, sell the house, pay debts, move Dad somewhere cheaper, and call it care. For 3 weeks, my life became a table covered in paper. I built a chronological binder the way I had built case files for federal contractors who believed volume could hide fraud. Late-night calls, property tax delinquency, my payment, refinance date, bank transfers, phone records, deleted voicemail gap, legal retainer payment, realtor emails, Rose's letter, USB recording, Ruth Delaney statement, Claire Benson statement. I marked originals, copies, dates, sources, and questions. I slept poorly but clearly. Grief had become motion. I did not play the USB recording until the night before I finished the binder. I told myself I needed the right adapter, then the right software, then the right emotional distance. The truth was, I was afraid to hear my mother's voice. Once heard, it would become the last new thing she ever gave me. I sat at the kitchen table with Tom's old mug beside me and clicked the file. At first there was rustling, a faint clink, then Rose breathing. Her voice was weak but unmistakable. "Caleb, where did the money go?" she asked. Caleb's answer came sharp and impatient. "Mom, you don't understand business." Rose said, "I understand unpaid taxes." A chair scraped. Caleb lowered his voice, which made it more frightening. "If you call Evelyn again, I'll tell Dad you're losing your mind." There was a pause. Then Rose, quiet but steady, said, "I know what you're doing." I stopped the recording there the first time. I sat, trembling in the blue light of the laptop, and understood that this was no longer about money. It was about erasing the truth before anyone could hear it. The recess ended with Caleb angry and Mr. Keene careful. Those are not the same thing, and the difference mattered. Caleb returned to counsel table as if the break had offended him personally. Mr. Keene returned as a man who had discovered a snake in a drawer he had already opened. Arthur moved slowly behind them. When he sat, he looked toward me again, then away. Judge Porter resumed the matter with a warning about decorum that landed mostly on my brother. Caleb's mouth tightened. I opened my binder. Mr. Keene began presenting their case. He had recovered his voice, but not the easy rhythm he had possessed before my question about clearance. He framed Caleb as the dutiful son and me as the late-arriving daughter. He introduced family photographs, birthdays where I was missing, holidays where Caleb stood behind Rose's chair, a church picnic where Arthur and Caleb held matching plates of barbecue while Mom smiled between them. Each photograph was supposed to prove abandonment. I looked at them and saw what photographs always hide. They showed where bodies stood, not what debts were paid, not what phone calls were made from hotel rooms and places I could not name, not what letters were read under dim light by women too tired to defend themselves. Caleb testified with practiced hurt. I stayed, he said. She left. He said it so often it became a drumbeat. I stayed. She left. I handled things. She came back when the property mattered. I watched Judge Porter taking notes. Good judges listen not only for facts, but for repetition. Repetition often marks the place where evidence should have been. Then came Arthur's affidavit. Mr. Keene submitted it with a solemnity that made my stomach tighten before I saw the page. My father had signed a statement saying he believed I had pressured Rose, caused confusion, and interfered near the end of her life. The signature was his, shaky but real. For a moment, the courtroom narrowed. I could hear rain on the windows again. I could hear Caleb's chair creak. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Arthur had not merely sat behind Caleb. He had signed against me. Judge Porter asked Arthur whether he understood the statement. Caleb shifted immediately. Dad knows what happened, he said. Mr. Reed, the judge said, her voice sharpening, I asked your father. Arthur cleared his throat. He looked at the paper as if it had grown longer since he signed it. Caleb told me it was background information, he said, for the estate. I rose slowly. Your Honor, may I ask my father a few questions? Judge Porter studied me, then nodded. I turned toward Arthur, not Caleb, not Mr. Keene. Arthur. Dad, did you read every page before you signed? His pride fought the truth for several seconds. No, he said at last. My eyes are not what they were. Did Caleb explain that this document accused me of manipulating Mom? Arthur looked at Caleb. Caleb stared straight ahead. No, Arthur said. He said it was for the estate. A murmur moved through the gallery. Caleb snapped. He knew what he was signing. Judge Porter's gavel came down once. Mr. Reed, you will not coach, correct, or intimidate anyone in this courtroom. Caleb's face reddened. For the first time, my father looked uncertain of the son beside him. I did not attack Arthur. There was no need. Cruelty would have made me look like what Caleb claimed I was. Instead, I asked him whether he remembered the dates of Rose's late illness, whether he had seen bank statements, whether he had known about any unpaid property taxes, and whether he had authorized Caleb to speak for him in financial matters. His answers were slow and increasingly small. No, not really. Caleb handled that. I thought it was paid. I trusted him. Each answer laid another board across the bridge from old belief to present fact. Caleb grew restless. People like him fear silence because silence gives others room to think. He leaned forward. Dad was there, he said. He knows who took care of them. He knows who handled the bills. I turned. Which bills, Caleb? He froze for half a second. It was barely visible, but I saw it. So did Mr. Keene. The judge may have as well. All of them, Caleb said. Medical, utilities, taxes, everything. The property taxes? I asked. Yes. And they were current? I was handling them. That is not what I asked. His jaw worked. They were being handled. I let that sit. Then I asked the question I had been waiting to ask since finding the refinance papers. Caleb, according to your complaint, when did our mother become too cognitively impaired to understand estate documents? Mr. Keene stood. Objection. Calls for a medical conclusion. Your Honor, I said, the petitioner's own allegations rely on a timeline of alleged incapacity. I am asking him to identify the timeline he presented. Judge Porter overruled the objection narrowly. Caleb looked annoyed, then vague. It was gradual. A month, Caleb. Early spring, he said. Maybe April, around then. I opened the binder to the tab marked Refi. Your Honor, I said, if my mother was too impaired to understand her will in early spring, I would like my brother to explain why he used her signatures 6 weeks later to borrow against the family property. Arthur's voice broke from the second row. What loan? No one moved. Even the rain seemed to pause. Caleb turned halfway toward our father, then stopped, as if realizing any answer to Arthur would also be an answer to the court. Mr. Keene closed his eyes briefly. He had not known. I could tell. Lawyers can fake many things, but the first impact of undisclosed material facts has a recognizable shape. It is the face of a man discovering he has been walking beside a cliff in fog. Judge Porter asked to see the documents. I submitted copies with the originals available. The clerk carried them forward. The judge read for several minutes while the courtroom waited. Caleb whispered harshly to Mr. Keene. Mr. Keene whispered back without looking at him. Arthur leaned forward, his hands gripping the cane so tightly his knuckles whitened. When the judge looked up, her expression had changed. The loan amount appears to exceed $200,000, she said. Mr. Reed, were you aware of this transaction? Arthur swallowed. No, ma'am. He had grown up in a world where men did not call female judges ma'am because of court protocol, but because their mothers had raised them properly. The small courtesy made his confusion sadder. Caleb tried temporary. He tried business expansion. He tried helping the family. He tried saying Rose agreed. I asked, then she was competent enough to agree? He looked at me with hatred because he understood the trap only after stepping into it. She had good days. Good enough to sign a loan? Yes. But not good enough to discuss estate choices with me? You pressured her. Did I pressure her before or after you took her to sign the refinance? Mr. Keene stood again, but more slowly this time. Your Honor, I would request that my client be permitted to confer with counsel before further response. Judge Porter looked at Caleb. That may be wise. The fake marina expansion collapsed next. Caleb had claimed the refinance funds were for a planned expansion connected to his marina repair operation. It sounded plausible to people who did not check permits. I had checked permits. There were no county development filings, no business license amendments, no waterfront lease, no contractor deposits, no environmental review inquiries, no serious loan application materials beyond the refinance itself. I submitted the records, or rather the absence of records, which in investigations often speaks louder than the paper people produce. You don't understand local business, Caleb said. I understand documentation, I answered. That has been enough. Then came the tax records. I did not enjoy that part. People think revenge feels like heat. For me, it felt cold. I submitted the county notices showing delinquency and early lien warnings. Arthur stared at them as if they were written in another language. Caleb had told him taxes were handled. Caleb had told everyone he handled the bills. I submitted my payment confirmation next. Nearly $16,000 from my account, paid quietly months before the lawsuit. Judge Porter looked from the document to me. "Why did you make this payment, Miss Reed?" "Because I did not want my father humiliated," I said. "And because the house mattered to my mother." My voice almost broke on mother, but not quite. I did not tell Dad because I believed it would hurt his pride. I did not tell Caleb because I did not trust his explanation. Arthur turned toward Caleb. "You told me taxes were handled." Caleb's eyes darted. "They were. I had a plan." "Your plan was a lien notice?" I asked. "Your plan was letting Dad believe the house was safe while penalties grew?" Caleb pointed at me. "You love this. You love making me look bad." "No," I said. "You made yourself look bad." I brought dates. The gallery had changed. Earlier, people had leaned toward Caleb's story with the lazy appetite families have for old gossip. Now they sat back. Darlene, who had whispered about the house, stared at her lap. A courtroom shift is almost physical. You can feel sympathy moving like weight from one side of the room to the other. I did not want their sympathy. Sympathy is fickle. I wanted the record. Bank transfers followed. I did not dump every page on the court. That is a mistake amateurs make. Too much evidence can become fog. I chose examples tied to Caleb's own timeline. Transfers after he claimed Rose could not understand financial matters. Cashier's checks routed toward business expenses. The appraisal payment, the retainer payment. Caleb said Rose wanted to help him. I asked why a woman too confused to change her will was clear enough to authorize multiple transfers into his business account. He said I was twisting things. I said, "No, Caleb, I am aligning them." The retainer payment landed harder than I expected. I submitted the bank statement showing a payment to Martin Keene's firm from funds connected to my parents' household. Then I looked directly at Mr. Keene. "Were you aware your retainer was paid from an account connected to Arthur and Rose Reed's household funds?" Mr. Keene stood very still. "No," he said. He turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I need to state for the record that my client did not disclose the source of those funds to me." Caleb exploded. "You're supposed to be on my side." Mr. Keene turned on him with the first honest anger I had seen from him all morning. "I am your attorney, Caleb. I am not your accomplice." The line hit the courtroom like a dropped glass. Even Judge Porter paused before writing. Arthur bent forward, both hands over the cane, breathing through his mouth. For a terrible second, I thought he might faint. The deputy stepped closer, but Dad waved him off. "I didn't know," he whispered. The words were not addressed to anyone, which made them worse. I did not rush to comfort him. Part of me wanted to. Another part remembered the affidavit, the bench, the years of believing the child who stayed because staying was easier to see. There are moments when compassion and anger stand in the same body, neither willing to leave. Judge Porter's voice became formal in the way judges sound when a case changes category inside their minds. She stated that the court now had concerns about potential financial misrepresentation, elder dependency, misuse of household or estate-related funds, misleading affidavits, and questionable property transactions. Caleb stared at her as if she had betrayed him by listening. For the first time that day, fear replaced insult in his eyes. Not fear of losing face, fear of losing control. "Miss Reed," Judge Porter said, "do you have further evidence you wish the court to consider at this stage?" I looked down at the sealed envelope in my binder. Rose's handwriting waited on the front like a hand on my shoulder. Caleb saw it. His face changed so quickly it almost hurt to watch. "That letter shouldn't be admitted," he said. The judge looked at him sharply. "And why would that be, Mr. Reed?" Caleb opened his mouth, then closed it. "There are answers that confess too much. I submitted the envelope with the care it deserved. I explained where I found it, who was present, how I preserved it, and what it contained." Judge Porter examined the envelope, the handwriting, the date on the certified mail receipt Rose had tucked inside, and the chain of custody notes I had made the day I recovered it. Caleb objected through Mr. Keene, but Mr. Keene's objection lacked appetite. He had gone from advocate to damage control. The judge admitted the letter for the limited purposes before the court, noting that weight and final admissibility could be addressed further if necessary. Caleb looked at Arthur. Arthur did not look back. He was staring at the stationery. He knew it. Of course he knew it. Rose had written grocery lists, birthday notes, sympathy cards, and church reminders on that pale cream paper for 20 years. I did not read the letter theatrically. My mother deserved better than performance. I read it clearly, with both hands on the page. If Evelyn is reading this in court, then things have become worse than I wanted to believe. Caleb has taken over more than helping. At first, I was grateful. Your father trusted him, and I wanted peace in the house. But money has gone places I do not understand. And when I ask questions, Caleb becomes angry or tells me I'm confused. Arthur does not know everything. I have tried to ask, but Caleb speaks first. I am ashamed that I let it go this far. The courtroom held its breath around Rose's words. Arthur's face crumpled, then hardened, then crumpled again. Grief is not one expression, it is a crowd. I continued. Rose wrote that Caleb had blamed business stress, that she had seen withdrawals she could not explain, that he kept statements away from her, that he told her asking questions would upset Arthur. She wrote that he used my name as a threat. "If you call Evelyn, Dad will think you're losing your mind." She wrote that she had begun hiding notes because she feared being told her own memory was proof against her. My mother, who had once run a household on one shipyard income, coupons, and stubborn grace, had been made to feel unreliable in her own kitchen. Then came the part I had not read aloud to anyone before. Evelyn did not abandon us. Her work required silence. I know Arthur never understood that, and perhaps I did not understand all of it either, but I knew my daughter. She carried duty the way some people carry prayer. She missed holidays, but she did not stop loving us. She sent help without asking for credit. Arthur mistook her silence for indifference, and Caleb learned how to use that wound. My father covered his mouth. I had never seen him do that, not when his own father died. Not when Tom died, not even when Rose died. He covered his mouth like a man trying to keep the past from escaping through it. Caleb stared at the table. For once, he had no immediate answer. My mother had named not only his actions, but the family poison that fed them. Caleb did not create my father's resentment. He learned to spend it. The phone records came next. I had debated whether to include them because they hurt me more than they helped the legal argument. But truth is not a buffet. I submitted the record of Rose's 3 calls the night before her final hospitalization, the longest lasting 42 seconds, and my own phone record showing no voicemail received. Ruth Delaney's statement placed Caleb in possession of Rose's phone that evening. I did not accuse him of causing her decline. I did not make claims I could not prove. I said only what the evidence supported. Rose tried to call me, Caleb denied it, and the voicemail was deleted before I heard it. Arthur turned slowly toward Caleb. "You deleted your mother's message." Caleb stared straight ahead. His silence answered with more force than denial. Arthur whispered, What did she say? Caleb still said nothing. That may have been the cruelest moment for Dad, because he realized the theft was not only mine. Rose may have been trying to tell me something that could have saved Arthur from months of manipulation. Caleb had robbed all of us and called it care. Caleb finally muttered, "A letter proves nothing." His voice was hoarse. I looked at him, and for a second, I saw the little boy during thunderstorms, terrified of thunder yet too proud to admit it. Then he lifted his chin with the old defiance, and the boy vanished behind the man he had chosen to become. "I know," I said. "That is why Mom did not only leave a letter." I submitted the USB drive. Judge Porter took the foundation carefully, as she should. The court recessed briefly to allow the file to be reviewed for authenticity concerns and playback logistics. Caleb argued. Mr. Keene mostly listened. Arthur sat as if age had finally become heavy. When the audio played, my mother's voice entered the courtroom without a body. No one can prepare for that. Rose breathed through the speaker, weak, close, real. "Caleb, where did the money go?" she asked. Caleb's recorded voice answered, "Mom, you don't understand business." Rose said, "I understand unpaid taxes." A scrape, a shift. Then Caleb, low and sharp, "If you call Evelyn again, I'll tell Dad you're losing your mind." Rose's final line came softer than the rest, but steadier. "I know what you're doing." No one spoke when it ended. The silence was unlike the silence after my clearance question. That earlier silence had been tactical, startled, fearful. This one was moral. It was the silence that follows when a dead woman tells the truth, and the living have to decide whether to remain cowards. The realtor emails finished what the recording began. Miles Carter's name had seemed minor when I found it. In court, it became the map of Caleb's intention. I submitted the valuation request dated before the lawsuit, the phrase "family objections removed," the question about a fast closing, the inquiry about moving an elderly parent to a lower-cost facility 2 counties away. Arthur read the pages with visible difficulty. "You were going to sell my house?" he asked. Caleb turned to him quickly. "Dad, I was trying to take care of you." "By selling my house? You can't manage it alone." "Rose died in that house," Arthur said. His voice had the old shipyard steel in it for the first time all day. "I paid for that house." I placed another page on the table. Caleb had written to Miles, "My father will go along once the legal part is settled." Arthur read that line twice. Something in him seemed to collapse inward. Caleb had not been caring for him. Caleb had been managing him. Once exposed, Caleb did what cornered people often do. He abandoned strategy for injury. "You all think she's so perfect," he said, pointing at me. "Saint Evelyn with her classified life and her plaques and her important friends. She leaves, and somehow, she still gets to be the one Mom trusts. I stayed. I was the one here. I was the one Dad called. I was the one dealing with doctors and bills and her moods and his stubbornness." His voice broke on stubbornness, and for a moment, I heard exhaustion beneath resentment. Then he kept going. "She left and still became the daughter they respected. I stayed and still felt like a guest in my own family." There it was, not a legal defense, a confession of motive. Caleb had not stolen because he was only desperate, though he was desperate. He had not lied because paperwork confused him, though confusion had been useful. He had done all of it inside a story where my existence diminished him. My absence had become larger than his presence. Rose's love for me had felt like theft to him. Arthur's disappointment in him had felt easier to aim at me than to face in himself. He had turned the family into a courtroom long before I stood in one. You were not punished because I served, I said. My voice surprised me by staying calm. You punished everyone because you could not stand feeling small. Caleb flinched. I continued because some truths need plain language. You did not borrow from mom and dad. You cornered them. You used dad's resentment and mom's illness, and my absence and your own debt, as if all of it entitled you to control. That is not caregiving. That is capture. Mr. Keene stood then, slowly, and addressed the judge. He stated that his client had withheld material facts, including the refinance, the source of retainer funds, and communications concerning the possible sale of the property. He could not continue presenting claims contradicted by newly admitted evidence without further review. He did not withdraw on the spot, because courts have procedures and lawyers have obligations, but every person in the room understood the separation had begun. Caleb looked abandoned. It was the first honest thing his face had shown all day. Judge Porter made no melodramatic speech. Real judges rarely do. But her findings were devastating in their restraint. The record before the court did not support Caleb's allegations that I had exploited Rose or manipulated estate documents. Instead, it raised serious concerns about financial misrepresentation, potential elder exploitation, misuse of family funds, misleading affidavits, questionable property transactions, and possible forged or coerced signatures. She ordered disclosures, restricted any sale or encumbrance of the property without oversight, and set further review mechanisms in motion. Caleb came to court to put me on trial. By late afternoon, the case had turned around and faced him. Then Judge Porter looked at me. Ms. Reed, given the evidence before this court, do you intend to pursue the maximum civil remedies available to you personally? The question settled over the room. Caleb turned pale. Arthur looked at the floor. Darlene stopped pretending not to listen. I had enough evidence to ruin my brother in ways that would outlive anger. I could press for sanctions, damages, referrals, every sharp legal instrument available. A younger version of me might have thought justice required using every tool. An older version knew tools do not become righteous because the hand holding them has been hurt. I looked at Caleb and saw too many people at once. The baby reaching for my hair, the boy hiding from thunder, the teenager sobbing when our old dog Buck died because he had pretended not to love him, the man who had spent decades measuring himself against a sister who was not competing, the brother who had taken fear, debt, jealousy, and pride and braided them into cruelty. Understanding is not forgiveness, but it does change the flavor of punishment. My mother wanted the truth known, I said. She did not ask me to finish destroying what pride had already damaged. Caleb stared at me. I continued. I will cooperate with any review the court orders. I will provide records. I will seek protection for my father and for the property. I will not ask that evidence be ignored. But personally, I am not asking this court to give me the pleasure of destroying my brother. Judge Porter watched me carefully. You understand the distinction? Yes, Your Honor. Consequences are necessary. Revenge is optional. That answer did not save Caleb from consequences. It was not meant to. The claims against me were dismissed or forced toward withdrawal. Estate-related finances were ordered into review. Caleb was removed from informal control over Arthur's accounts pending further oversight. An independent fiduciary arrangement was recommended. Questionable transfers had to be documented. Business records had to be produced. The refinance documents were referred for further civil examination, and any property sale required court oversight and informed consent. Caleb did not leave free in the way he had entered. He left, stopped. The hardest part came after the orders. when Arthur stood with effort and turned toward me in open court. His face looked older than it had that morning, but clearer. "Evelyn," he said. My name in his mouth sounded unused. I waited. "I believe the child who stayed, Hank," he said, voice shaking. "I never asked what the child who left was carrying." The courtroom blurred. I did not go to him. Not then. The pain was too old for a hallway embrace to solve. But I heard him. Sometimes, hearing is the first mercy. Caleb approached me near the exit while Mr. Keene spoke with the clerk. The deputy watched him, and Caleb noticed, which seemed to humiliate him more than anything else. "Why didn't you finish it?" he asked. He sounded almost angry that I had left anything undone. "Because someone in this family has to stop confusing pain with punishment," I said. He looked away. For once, he had no insult ready. Weeks passed before Arthur came to my house. Court can reveal truth, but it cannot repair a family by itself. Orders were filed, accounts were reviewed. Caleb's business records proved worse than even I expected. There were debts layered over debts, personal expenses disguised as business costs, and transfers he had described as loans without any evidence of repayment terms. The property could not be sold from under Arthur. Claire gave a statement. Ruth gave hers. Miles Carter confirmed the emails. Martin Keene withdrew from representing Caleb in anything connected to the disputed matters. The county did what counties do. Slowly, procedurally, without music. I returned to the bay and tried to remember how to live in a house not covered by documents. Some mornings I walked down to the water before sunrise with coffee and Tom's old jacket over my shoulders. I thought about Rose often, not only as a victim or a witness, but as my mother. I remembered her hands kneading biscuit dough, her humming off key in the kitchen, her belief that every sad event required someone to bring a casserole. I hated that her last gift to me had been evidence. I loved her for leaving it anyway. The knock came on a Sunday afternoon while wind pushed whitecaps across the bay. I opened the door and found Arthur standing on my porch with a grocery bag in one hand and his cane in the other. He looked as if he had dressed carefully, clean shirt, old cardigan, shoes polished unevenly. The grocery bag sagged with the weight of a container. "Brought soup," he said. Men of my father's generation often need a practical excuse for emotional trespass. "What kind?" I asked. "Chicken." "Did you make it?" He frowned. "Bought it from that place your mother liked." That almost made me smile. "Come in, Dad." We sat at my kitchen table overlooking the Chesapeake. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The soup sat between us like a peace offering nobody had agreed to name. Arthur looked around my kitchen, at Tom's mug on the shelf, at the framed photograph of my mother on the windowsill, at the old navy coat hanging near the hallway because I had taken it from storage after court and had not decided what to do with it. His eyes paused on the coat, then moved away. "I was hard on you," he said finally. I looked at him. "You were." He flinched, not because he expected denial, but because truth from a daughter can sound harsher than accusation from a judge. "When you left," he said, "I thought you were saying we weren't enough. I was 19. I know. I was trying to become someone. I know that now." He rubbed his thumb against the handle of his cane. "Your mother tried to tell me. Many times. I wouldn't hear it. It was easier to be angry than afraid." That was the first explanation of my father I had ever believed. Anger had been his armor against the fear that his daughter would outgrow him. "I never forgot you," I said. The words came out smaller than I intended. I could not talk about most of my life. Sometimes I could not tell you where I was. Sometimes I missed things because if I left, someone else paid for it. That does not make me noble. It made me absent. I know that. But it was never because I did not care. Arthur's eyes filled and he blinked hard, offended by his own tears. Were you ever scared? He asked. No one in my family had asked me that in 40 years. They had asked whether I was safe, whether I was promoted, whether I would be home, whether I had met important people, whether the Navy was treating me well. They had never asked whether fear had sat beside me. I looked out at the gray water. Sometimes, I said, not always in the ways people imagine. Sometimes during emergencies, yes. But sometimes it was hotel rooms after classified calls. Sometimes it was missing a funeral and knowing nobody would understand why. Sometimes it was watching you and Mom get older in photographs. Sometimes it was coming home and realizing the family had built a version of me I could not correct without violating things I had sworn to protect. Arthur closed his eyes. When he opened them, he looked less like a judge of my life and more like a man who had arrived late to his own daughter. A second knock came before either of us could say more. Arthur stiffened. I knew before opening the door who it was. Caleb stood on the porch with no tie, no performance, no practiced injury. He looked older than 58. Shame ages people quickly when it finally reaches the surface. I can go, he said. I almost did. 3 times. I stepped back. Come in or don't, Caleb. I am done dragging truth out of people. He came in. The 3 of us stood in my kitchen like strangers assigned to the same memory. Caleb looked at Arthur first. The debt was worse than I said, he admitted. His voice was rough. I kept thinking I could fix it. One more loan, one more job, one more deal. Then Mom got sick and everything got tighter and I panicked. Arthur said nothing. Caleb looked at me. I lied to Dad. I used what he already believed about you because it was easy. He swallowed. I hated you for leaving because, even gone, you felt bigger than me. Mom missed you. Dad complained about you, but he still measured me against you. I know that doesn't excuse anything. No, I said. It does not. He nodded. I'm not asking you to forgive me today. That was the first wise thing he had said in a long time. I told him what would happen. He would cooperate with the review. He would document what he could repay and repay what he could. He would not control Arthur's accounts again. He would not contact realtors about the house. He would not speak of Rose as if her confusion were a tool he could still use. If he wanted any place in the family, it would begin with honesty so plain it embarrassed him. Caleb nodded through all of it. He looked relieved not because the consequences were light, but because someone had finally drawn a line he could not talk his way around. Arthur pushed back from the table then. At first, I thought he needed to stand because pain had stiffened his hips. But he walked past us, toward the hallway where the old navy coat hung. It was dark blue, heavier than I remembered, with years folded into the seams. I had kept it, not because I wore it, but because throwing it away felt like discarding a witness. Arthur reached out and touched the sleeve with 2 fingers. His hand trembled from arthritis and age because I never liked this thing, he said. I almost laughed. I know. Not because of the coat, he said, but because it proved you belonged to a world I couldn't order around. He turned back to me. For decades, Arthur Reed had refused to honor the part of my life he did not understand. He had treated my service as absence, my silence as arrogance, my duty as rejection. Now, in my narrow hallway with soup cooling on the table and Caleb standing ashamed behind him, my father straightened as much as his body allowed. His shoulders lifted, his chin rose. He raised his trembling hand to his brow and saluted me. I should have done that years ago, he said. I could not speak. There are sentences that arrive too late to repair what they name, but still arrive in time to matter. The salute was not about rank or uniform. It was my father acknowledging the daughter he had spent 40 years misjudging. It was Rose's letter becoming flesh. It was the old story. Caleb stayed and Evelyn left, finally breaking open to reveal what it had hidden. I stepped forward and hugged him. He was thinner than memory, all bones and cardigan and stubborn breath. After a moment, Caleb stepped closer. I felt him hesitate, waiting for permission he did not deserve but needed. I let him into the embrace, not because everything was fixed, not because court orders had become forgiveness, not because Rose's missing voicemail had stopped hurting. I let him in because pride had finally stopped speaking louder than love, and because my mother had not raised me to confuse mercy with surrender. Healing did not erase damage. Truth did not return lost years. Forgiveness did not cancel consequences. Caleb still had records to produce, money to account for, and trust to rebuild one honest inch at a time. Arthur still had to live with the knowledge that the child he defended had used him, and the child he doubted had protected him. I still had mornings when anger rose before coffee, when I heard Rose's recorded voice and wanted to break something that could not be repaired. But the house by the bay became quieter after that, not because pain left, but because lies did. People misunderstand quiet strength. They mistake absence for abandonment, silence for indifference, age for weakness, and forgiveness for surrender. They see a gray-haired widow standing alone at a defense table and assume she is alone because nobody came with her. They see a loud man with a lawyer and assume volume has weight. They see an old father sitting on the wrong bench and think the case is already decided. But the most dangerous person in a courtroom is not always the one with the loudest attorney. Sometimes it is the quiet woman with a folder full of dates. Sometimes it is the daughter who learned to let liars talk until they built their own cage. Sometimes it is the mother who dies and still finds a way to testify. I keep Rose's letter in a fireproof box now, beside Tom's service photograph and the receipt for the taxes I paid without telling anyone. I kept the blue recipe box too. The lemon pound cake card still has the mark where the USB drive was taped. Every so often, when the bay is gray and the rain sounds like that morning in court, I take the card out and run my thumb over my mother's handwriting. I think about the courtroom, Caleb's laugh, Mr. Keene's pale face, Arthur's whispered, "What loan?" and the silence after Rose's voice filled the room. I do not feel victorious when I think of it. Victory is too clean a word for family. I feel seen. For the first time in 40 years, that is enough. The first time Caleb tried to call after that Sunday, I let the phone ring twice before answering. Not because I wanted to punish him with uncertainty, though maybe a small part of me did, but because old reflexes take time to unlearn. For years, a call from Caleb had meant a need wearing the costume of crisis. Money, explanation, blame, some urgent practical problem that became my moral test if I hesitated. This time, he did not begin with a complaint. He said, "I found another statement." His voice held no performance. "It is from the business account. I think the reviewer needs it." I close my eyes. Accountability can sound ordinary when it begins. "Then send it," I said. "All of it." He said he would. Then, after a pause, "Evelyn?" "Yes." "I'm sorry about Mom's message." He did not explain. He did not soften the theft by calling it a mistake. He did not say he had been stressed or afraid. He said sorry into the space where her voice should have been. And for that one moment, I believed he understood the size of what he had taken. Arthur began visiting on Thursdays. At first, he always brought something: soup, a loaf of bread, a bag of oranges, a newspaper clipping about veterans, even when the article had nothing to do with my service. Practical excuses. Eventually, he stopped pretending. He would sit at my kitchen table and ask questions he should have asked decades earlier. He asked where I had trained, what logistics compliance meant, whether Tom had liked being near water after leaving the Coast Guard, whether I had friends from those years. I answered what I could. When I could not answer, he no longer took it as rejection. He would nod and say, "Classified?" Sometimes yes, sometimes simply too hard. Both answers were accepted at last. One afternoon, he brought an old shoebox from his house. Inside were letters I had written from boot camp and early duty stations, letters I thought he had thrown away or ignored. The envelopes were softened at the edges from being handled. "Your mother kept them," he said. Then, after a moment, I read them after she went to bed. I stared at him. "You never wrote back." "I know." The shame in his voice was quiet. "I thought if I wrote, it meant I approved." That was such an Arthur Reed sentence that I almost laughed and cried at the same time. Pride had stolen even his replies. He slid the box toward me. "I should have told you I kept them." I opened the first letter and saw my 19-year-old handwriting, eager and cramped, trying to sound brave for parents who could not agree on whether to miss me. The past does not return, but sometimes it sends receipts. The financial review lasted months. It was not cinematic. There were spreadsheets, statements, requests, delays, extensions, and meetings in rooms that smelled of stale coffee. Caleb had to sell equipment from his business, close accounts, and sign repayment agreements that would follow him longer than his anger had. He was not led away in handcuffs, and some people might think that means justice failed. They are people who do not understand slow consequences. Caleb lost control, credibility, and the mythology he had built around himself. He had to sit across from professionals and answer questions without turning them into speeches about sacrifice. He had to face Arthur without the old shield of being the good son. That was punishment enough to begin with. Darlene called once to apologize for what she had whispered in court. Her apology was long and clumsy, full of, "I only knew what Caleb told us, and you have to understand how it looked." I let her talk until she ran out of excuses. Then I said, "Yes, Darlene, I understand how it looked. That was the problem." She cried a little. I did not comfort her much. Families often want forgiveness to arrive before accountability because guilt makes them uncomfortable. I had learned to let discomfort do its work. I also learned that being seen did not magically remove loneliness. After the case, people who had ignored me for years suddenly wanted lunch, coffee, explanations. Cousins sent messages beginning with, "I had no idea." Old neighbors said Rose would be proud. Some of it was kind. Some of it was curiosity dressed up as concern. I accepted what I could and declined what I did not owe. The truth had come out in court, but my life was not public property. I had spent too many years being misread by people who never asked better questions. I no longer felt obligated to reward late interest with full access. At night, I sometimes dreamed of the courtroom. In the dream, Caleb's laugh stretched longer than it had in life, filling the room until the walls bent. Then Rose's voice would cut through it. "I know what you're doing." I would wake with my heart hammering and the bay wind rattling the windows. On those nights, I made tea in Tom's red kettle and sat at the table until dawn softened the glass. Grief, I had learned, is not finished by justice. It simply changes rooms. One spring morning, nearly a year after Rose died, Arthur asked me to drive him to the cemetery. Caleb met us there. He looked nervous, holding a small bundle of yellow flowers, because Rose had loved yellow in defiance of every tasteful arrangement anyone bought her. We stood at her grave under a sky so blue it felt almost rude. Arthur leaned on his cane and said, "Your mother was right about more than I knew." Caleb bowed his head. I placed my hand on the stone. Rose Ellen Reed, beloved wife and mother, dates separated by a dash too small to hold a life. She usually was, I said. Caleb stepped forward last. "Mom," he said, then stopped. His throat worked. For once, he did not look around to see who was watching. "I used your fear. I'm sorry." The wind moved through the cemetery grass. No voice answered. That is the difficult thing about apologizing to the dead. You do it without the mercy of response. He placed the flowers down and stepped back. I did not tell him it was enough. It was not. But it was a true sentence, and true sentences had become the only foundation I trusted. Afterward, Arthur wanted to stop by the old house. Court oversight had kept it safe, and arrangements were being made for him to remain there with help. He did not have to beg from either child. The house looked tired but standing. Rose's curtains were still in the front window because nobody had been able to take them down. In the kitchen, the empty space where the blue recipe box used to sit seemed almost bright. Arthur noticed me looking. "You should keep it," he said. "She meant it for you." I nodded. Caleb, standing near the sink, said, "She meant the truth for all of us." That was another true sentence. He seemed to be collecting them slowly, like a man learning a new language after years of shouting in the old one. The old family story did not disappear overnight. Stories rarely do. Some relatives still spoke of Caleb's stress before they spoke of his choices. Some framed my evidence as Evelyn always was organized, as if documentation were a personality quirk rather than the thing that saved our father's home. Arthur still sometimes slipped and said, "When you left us," then caught himself and corrected it to, "when you joined." Each correction mattered. A family rewrites history the same way it first wrote the lie, one repeated phrase at a time. I began volunteering twice a month with a Veterans Records Clinic, helping older service members and surviving spouses organize documents for benefits, appeals, and burial arrangements. It was not heroic work. It was folders, dates, copies, signatures, and patient explanations. In other words, it suited me. I met men who had never told their children where they had served, women whose families thought their work had been clerical because that was easier than imagining danger, widows who arrived with shoeboxes of papers and left with a timeline. Every time I helped someone label a folder, I thought of Rose taping a USB drive behind lemon pound cake. Evidence is not cold when it protects love. One woman at the clinic, a retired Army nurse named Marisol, asked me why I volunteered. I told her a shorter version of the truth. My family learned late that paperwork can be a love language. She laughed, then cried without warning because her husband's discharge papers had been missing for 6 years, and we found a copy in a scanned archive. People think documents are bureaucratic. Sometimes they are the only witnesses the dead can send. Caleb eventually found work managing inventory for a marine supply company that did not belong to him. That was important. Ownership had always fed his fantasies. Wages humbled him in ways entrepreneurship never had. He had a supervisor, a schedule, and tasks with measurable completion. When he told me about it, he sounded embarrassed. "It's not much," he said. "It is honest," I answered. He looked at me as if honest was a heavier word than successful. Maybe it is. Arthur's health continued to decline in ordinary, undramatic ways. His knees worsened, His hearing faded unless he disagreed, in which case he heard perfectly. He allowed a home aide 3 mornings a week after I showed him the cost comparison and reminded him that refusing help was not proof of independence if it made everyone else frantic. He grumbled but agreed. Caleb was allowed to visit, not manage. That distinction became one of our family commandments. Visit, do not manage. Help, do not control. Explain, do not perform. On the anniversary of Rose's death, I made lemon pound cake from the stained recipe card. I am not much of a baker. Tom used to say my cooking improved dramatically when instructions included torque specifications. But I followed Rose's card exactly, including the note in the margin that said, "A little extra zest never hurt anybody." Arthur ate 2 slices and pretended it was because they were small. Caleb cried after one bite. He tried to hide it behind a napkin. I let him. Mercy sometimes means not narrating another person's shame. We talked about Rose that day without turning her into evidence. We talked about how she sang while folding sheets, how she cheated at gin rummy by distracting Arthur with kisses, how she always bought too many peaches in July, and then complained about having to can them. Caleb told a story I had forgotten about Rose making him return a pack of gum he stole from the drugstore and apologized to the cashier while she stood behind him like a tiny judge. "She scared me more than Dad ever did," he said. Arthur snorted. "Your mother could shame the devil into writing a thank you note." We laughed, and for a moment, laughter belonged to memory rather than cruelty. Still, there were boundaries. Caleb was not given keys to my house. He was not placed on any account. He did not speak with Arthur's aide about schedules unless I was copied. He once bristled at that and said, "Do you think I'm still that person?" I answered, "I think trust is not restored by your desire to be trusted." He walked away angry, then called the next day and said, "That was fair. Progress in some families is not a hug. It is a man admitting a boundary is fair." I kept thinking about Mr. Keene. Months after court, I received a short letter from him. It was formal, careful, and likely written with professional liability in mind. But underneath the caution was something human. He wrote that he regretted his part in advancing a narrative based on incomplete disclosures. He also wrote that he remembered the contractor case in the 1990s more clearly than he had admitted in court. He had been a junior associate then, watching a company unravel because I found one falsified logistics authorization buried in thousands of pages. "I should have remembered," he wrote, "that you did not ask questions unless you already knew where the answer would lead." I placed the letter in the file, not because I needed his apology, but because records should be complete. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had hired a lawyer immediately. A good attorney might have handled the case cleanly, shielded me from some pain, and prevented Caleb from humiliating himself so publicly. But Caleb's arrogance needed my apparent vulnerability. He had to believe I was alone. He had to laugh. He had to let Mr. Keene build the story around absence because that was the only way the contradiction would strike hard enough to break through Arthur's belief. I do not recommend self-representation as a general principle. Pride makes terrible legal counsel. But I did not represent myself from pride. I did it because the lie was built for an audience, and I needed the audience to watch its author lose control of the plot. The phrase, "who signed your security clearance," traveled through the family faster than any of the financial details. Cousins who did not understand clearance or compliance repeated it like a magic spell. That amused me. The question itself was not magic. It was a key to a locked room in Merkeen's memory. Years earlier, during that contractor investigation, I had sat across from men who smiled because they believed a woman with a quiet voice would drown in their paperwork. One authorization code had been copied forward after access expired. One false signature had permitted shipments that should never have moved. Everyone said it was an administrative oversight. It was not. Oversight is when a person misses a step. Fraud is when missing the step becomes the system. I learned then that arrogance leaves fingerprints because arrogant people believe only important people can recognize them. Caleb made the same mistake. Arthur asked me once whether I hated Caleb. We were sitting on my porch in late summer, watching gulls fight over something invisible. I took a long time to answer. No, I said finally, but I hate what he did. Arthur nodded. Is there a difference? There has to be, I said. Otherwise, the thing he did gets to define all of us. Arthur looked out at the water. I hated that you left, Annie, he said. But I never hated you. I know that now. Did you know it then? I did not answer. He closed his eyes. That is another thing I have to live with. It was not forgiveness exactly, but it was honest accounting. The family house survived the year. Repairs were made with monitored funds and contributions clearly documented because I had become almost religious about clarity. The porch rail was replaced. The roof leak near the back bedroom was fixed. Rose's curtains finally came down, washed, and rehung because Arthur said taking them down permanently felt like burying her twice. Caleb helped paint the kitchen under supervision, which irritated him until he dripped Primaire onto his shoe, and Arthur laughed so hard he had to sit. Laughter in that house had been gone too long. When it returned, it came cautiously, like a stray cat deciding whether people were safe. On the day we finished the kitchen, I found a recipe card tucked behind the drawer liner. It was not evidence. It was a recipe for peanut butter cookies written in Rose's hand with a note at the bottom. Caleb likes these soft. Evie likes them crisp. I stood alone by the counter and cried because my mother had known us before jealousy, before service, before debt, before courtrooms. She had known our cookie preferences and our secret fears. She had known we were not symbols in a family argument, but children she loved differently and completely. I copied the card and gave Caleb the original. He held it like it might burn. She remembered, he said. Of course she did, I replied. She was Mom. The most surprising change in my life was not Caleb's accountability or Arthur's apology. It was my own refusal to keep shrinking so others could remain comfortable. For years, I had allowed the family to misunderstand me because correcting them felt impossible or disloyal. I let jokes pass. I let accusations soften into silence. I let Arthur's disappointment become weather. After court, I stopped doing that. When someone said I had been gone, I said, I was serving. When someone said Caleb had done his best, I said, he did harm. When someone said Rose had been confused, I said, she was also clear. Truth did not require volume, but it did require repetition. The bay taught me that. Water repeats itself until stone changes shape. Not with fury every time, not with spectacle. Just return, return, return. I began to think of truth that way. You say it once in court and people gasp. Then you say it again at a kitchen table, again in a bank office, again to a cousin who prefers the old story, again to yourself when doubt creeps in wearing your father's voice. Eventually, the lie loses its smoothness. Eventually, it cannot be held comfortably. I never heard Rose's deleted voicemail, but I stopped imagining only the worst. For months, I tortured myself with possibilities. Maybe she had been pleading. Maybe she had been afraid. Maybe she had tried to say goodbye. One evening, while making tea, I had another thought. Maybe she had called to tell me about the blue recipe box. Maybe she had tried once more to put the truth in my hands. And because she knew Caleb might stop her, she had already made another plan. That thought did not erase the theft. It gave my mother back some agency. Caleb had taken one message. He had not taken her mind. He had not taken her preparation. He had not taken her love. The second time Arthur saluted me was at a small veterans event at the community hall. I had not planned to attend. Marcel from the Records Clinic bullied me into it by saying, "You can organize everybody else's proof of service, but God forbid anyone thank you for yours." Arthur came with Caleb, which surprised me. During the closing, when they asked veterans to stand, I stayed seated for half a second too long. Old habits. Then Arthur tapped his cane on my shoe. "Up," he whispered. I stood. The applause was polite and local and nothing like the courtroom silence. Arthur raised his hand again, steadier this time. Caleb did not salute, but he stood beside him with his head bowed. I accepted it. Recognition does not need to arrive all at once to be real. After the event, a young woman approached me. She could not have been more than 25, with nervous hands and a military recruitment brochure folded in her purse. "My dad thinks I'm abandoning the family if I go," she said. "Do you ever stop feeling guilty?" I looked at her and saw myself at 19, waiting for a bus with $20 from my mother and my father's cold handshake burning in my palm. "You learn to separate guilt from grief," I told her. You may grieve what your choice costs. That does not mean the choice is wrong. And the people who love you may need time to understand the difference." She nodded as if I had given her permission she had been afraid to request. Maybe I had. When I came home that night, I took Rose's letter from the fireproof box and read it again. Not the evidence sections, the part about duty. She carried duty the way some people carry prayer. I had stumbled over that sentence in court because it was too kind. Alone, I let it land. For years, I thought my mother's love for me survived despite my absence. Now I understood it had seen through the absence to the cost beneath. That kind of love is rare. It does not shout. It leaves a USB drive behind a cake recipe and trusts the right daughter to find it. Caleb and I will never be what we were as children. Maybe nobody is. Innocence is not a room you can re-enter by apologizing at the door. But we have built a narrow bridge. He calls before visiting. He asks before helping. He tells Arthur when he is angry instead of turning anger into control. Sometimes he fails. Sometimes I am sharper than necessary. Sometimes Arthur tries to pretend he cannot hear us and then offers an opinion from the next room. We are not healed in the clean way people like at the end of stories. We are honest more often than before. That is less pretty and more useful. I have been asked whether I regret not pursuing every possible penalty against Caleb. The answer depends on the day. On days when I think of the deleted voicemail, yes. Part of me wants a consequence with teeth sharp enough to match that loss. On days when I see him helping Arthur walk down the porch steps without taking over, I think stopping him was enough. Most days, I understand that mercy and anger can coexist without canceling each other. I did not spare Caleb because he deserved comfort. I spared myself from making his destruction the center of my remaining years. That is what revenge stories often get wrong. They end at exposure, as if the moment the villain falls, the wounded person becomes free. Exposure is powerful. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise. Watching Caleb's lie collapse in public gave me back something I had been denied for decades. But freedom came later, in quieter decisions. Not answering every gossip call, not replaying every insult, not letting the courtroom become the only place I felt strong, not mistaking my brother's shame for my purpose. The truth opened the cell. I still had to walk out. The last image I hold from that year is not the judge, the binder, or Caleb's face when the recording played. It is Arthur on my porch at sunset, months after the salute, holding a mug of coffee with both hands while the bay turned copper. He said without looking at me, "Your mother would have liked this view." "She did," I said. "She used to say the water made grief feel less trapped." Arthur nodded. "She was smarter than both of us." "Yes," I said. "She was." We sat there until the light faded. No courtroom could give me that. No order could force it. It came because truth, once spoken, had finally made room for something gentler to sit down. So, when I tell people my brother laughed because I had no lawyer, I do not tell it because the laugh was the most important part. It was only the door. Behind it were old resentments, unpaid taxes, hidden transfers, forged-looking signatures, a mother's courage, a father's pride, a brother's jealousy, and a quiet widow who had been underestimated one time too many. The laugh mattered because it showed what Caleb believed, that power was appearance, that loyalty was proximity, that age was weakness, and that I had come unarmed. He was wrong about all of it. There was one more thing I learned in the months after the hearing. Public truth and private truth do not travel at the same speed. Public truth moves in documents, court orders, transcripts, and signatures. It can be stamped, filed, and copied. Private truth has to move through pride, memory, shame, and habit. The court could stop Caleb from selling the house, but it could not stop Arthur from waking at 3 in the morning and replaying every time Rose had gone quiet when Caleb entered the room. The court could order financial review, but it could not make Darlene stop saying, "I just never thought Caleb would do that," as if disbelief were evidence. The court could clear my name, but it could not return the years when my father had measured my love by my physical distance from his porch. That part had to be lived through slowly. The first transcript I requested was not for legal strategy. It was for myself. I wanted the words in black and white because memory is vulnerable after trauma. It edits around pain. It softens some things and sharpens others until you begin doubting whether the room was as cold as you remember, whether Caleb really laughed, whether Arthur really said, "What loan?" in a voice that sounded like a man falling through ice. When the transcript arrived, I sat at my table with a pen and read it line by line. There it was. The laughter was not recorded as sound, only as the judge's admonition. My question to Mr. Keene was there exactly. The objection, the refinance, the tax payment, the retainer, the recording, the realtor emails, the sentence from my mother's letter. Arthur mistook her silence for indifference, and Caleb learned how to use that wound. Seeing those words typed by a stranger made them both less intimate and more undeniable. I sent a copy of the transcript to Arthur because he asked for it. Though I warned him it would hurt, he said, "Most things I need to read now hurt." He read slowly over several days. On the fourth day, he called and said, "I did not remember Caleb saying you loved making him look bad." "He said it," I replied. Arthur was quiet. "Your mother used to say guilt makes people accuse others of enjoying the truth." I smiled because that sounded exactly like Rose. Then Dad said, "I wish I had listened when she was alive." I did not rescue him from that wish. Some regrets have to be held until they teach. Claire Benson became an unexpected comfort. After her statement was taken, she wrote me a note on plain bank stationery. She said she had thought of Rose often after that March 14th meeting and wondered if she should have done more. I called her and told her discomfort is not always enough to intervene when a customer insists she is all right. Claire cried anyway. She had been trained to watch for elder exploitation, but exploitation inside families often wears familiar clothing. It arrives with a son carrying his mother's purse, a daughter answering questions too quickly, a spouse saying she gets confused before the older person has a chance to speak. Claire began pushing for additional training at the branch. "Your mother made me braver after the fact, eh?" she said. "She had that effect," I told her. Ruth Delaney came by my house once with a casserole because caregivers, like church ladies, believe food is the only acceptable container for complicated feeling. She stood in my doorway holding a foil pan of baked ziti and said, "I should have pushed harder." I took the pan from her. "Come in." She sat at my table and told me things that had not fit neatly into her statement. How Rose would relax when Caleb left the room, how Arthur's hearing seemed to fail whenever conflict threatened, how Caleb could be charming with nurses and cruel in the 5 seconds after they turned away. "He never hit her," Ruth said, staring at her hands. "People think if nobody gets hit, it isn't abuse. Control can bruise a life without marking skin," I said. Ruth looked up, and for a moment, we were two women who knew that truth from different rooms. Miles Carter, the realtor, was less emotional and more frightened. He had thought Caleb was just another stressed adult child trying to plan for an elderly parent's future. He admitted the phrase "family objections removed" had bothered him. But in real estate, people hear strange phrases and learn not to ask too much unless money looks impossible. After court, he sent all communications voluntarily. He also withdrew from any potential listing connected to the Reed property. "I don't want my name near this," he told me over the phone. I believed him. Fear can produce ethics after convenience fails. It is not the noblest route, but sometimes it still leads to the right road. The more records surfaced, the clearer Caleb's desperation became. He owed money to two suppliers, a private lender, a former business partner, and a credit card company that had learned to speak to him only through collections. He had borrowed against equipment already pledged elsewhere. He had used personal funds, business funds, and my parents' household funds so interchangeably that the accounts looked less like finances and more like a bucket passed under 3 leaking roofs. At one review meeting, he tried to explain a transfer by saying it was all family money anyway. The room went quiet. The fiduciary, a woman named Denise Walsh, with white hair and the patience of a granite step, looked at him over her glasses and said, "That sentence is the reason you are no longer trusted with it." Denise became another kind of judge in our lives. She was not impressed by Caleb's charm or Arthur's pride. When Dad complained that having a fiduciary made him feel like a child, Denise said, "Children do not have 86 years of habits to unlearn, Mr. Reed. You are not a child. You are a man whose trust was abused, and structure is how we keep that from happening again." Arthur respected her immediately, partly because she did not flatter him. Caleb feared her because she asked for receipts the way a surgeon asks for instruments, calmly with the expectation they will appear. One meeting took place in the old dining room, where we had eaten Thanksgiving under Caleb's performance of sainthood. Denise spread papers across the table. Arthur sat at one end, Caleb at the other, and I stood near the sideboard because sitting made me feel trapped. Rose's absence in that room was enormous. I could almost see her placing rolls in a basket, reminding Arthur to use the serving fork, tapping Caleb's hand when he reached across someone's plate. Denise asked Caleb to identify transfers one by one. At first, he tried explanations. then excuses. Then he simply said, "I don't remember," which was the last refuge of a man who remembered too well. Arthur listened until Caleb described a withdrawal as for household needs. Then Dad said, "Your mother was cutting coupons that week." Caleb stopped. The old man had finally begun aligning memory with records. It was painful to watch and necessary to see. I found another of Rose's notes in that dining room, tucked inside a china cabinet under a stack of linen napkins she had ironed before her hands became too weak. It was not addressed to Court. It was addressed to Arthur. I did not read it at first. I gave it to him. His hand shook as he unfolded it. He read silently, and then his face changed in a way that made Caleb stand up halfway from his chair. "What is it?" Caleb asked. Arthur waved him down. Later, Dad let me read it. Rose had written, "Art, if you find this, listen to Evelyn. Pride has made you deaf, but you are not a cruel man. Do not let Caleb turn your hurt into his permission." I had to sit down after reading it. My mother had known us all with terrifying accuracy. Arthur carried that note in his shirt pocket for weeks. I saw the folded edge every time he came to my house. It became his private evidence, not for court, but for conscience. When he got defensive, he would touch the pocket and stop. When Caleb tried to rush an explanation, Arthur would touch the pocket and say, "Slow down." Rose had found a way to correct him after death, and Arthur, who had resisted her in life when pride stood between them, obeyed the paper because grief had finally made him humble. The old house changed under Denise's oversight. Locks were rekeyed not to punish Caleb, but to mark a boundary. Automatic payments were set up for taxes and utilities. Statements went to Arthur, Denise, and me, with Caleb copied only where appropriate. That copy line annoyed him for months. "I'm his son," he said once. Denise answered, "Then act like one without needing account access." I nearly hugged her. We inventoried Rose's belongings properly. That task was harder than court. Evidence has purpose, belongings have scent. Dresses still held the shape of her shoulders. Her church gloves were folded in pairs. A drawer contained birthday cards she bought in advance, including one for Caleb he would never receive from her hand, and one for me with a lighthouse on the front. Inside mine, she had written only, "Evie, I am proud of the life you built, even the parts I was not allowed to know. Love, Mom." I sat on the bedroom floor and wept until my throat hurt. Caleb found his card later. He did not show it to me, but I heard him in the bathroom, trying to cry quietly and failing. We divided very little right away. Arthur was not ready. I took the recipe box because he insisted. Caleb took Rose's gardening hat after asking me if that was all right, which startled me. The hat was straw, frayed at the brim with a faded blue ribbon. "She wore it when she planted tomatoes," he said. "I know. I used to make fun of it." "You made fun of everything that embarrassed you by being tender," I said. He absorbed that without arguing. "Can I have it?" "Yes." He held it against his chest like a relic. I also found an old cassette tape labeled July 4th, 1988. Arthur had a player in the den that still worked after 3 slaps and a threat. The tape was mostly family noise. Fireworks, Rose laughing, Caleb complaining about mosquitoes, me home on leave and trying not to sound as tired as I was. Then my own younger voice said, "Dad, I can only stay 2 days." Arthur's younger voice answered, colder than memory had preserved. "Then, I suppose we should be grateful for the inspection." The tape crackled. Rose said sharply, "Arthur." I had forgotten that moment. Or maybe I had buried it because at 28, I still wanted him to miss me kindly. Arthur listened beside me, his face gray. "I said that?" "You did." You still came back after that? Yes. He covered his eyes. The past had witnesses everywhere once we started looking. That tape did something the court transcript could not. It showed Arthur his resentment while he still had time to repent for it. Not in abstract terms, in his own voice. He began apologizing for specific moments which mattered more than broad regret. He apologized for not coming to Tom's military retirement ceremony because he said the drive was too long. When the truth was, he did not want to stand among people who understood my life better than he did. He apologized for calling my work paper pushing when he had no idea what it required. He apologized for telling Rose not to make a shrine of my Navy photograph. Each apology reopened something, but each also cleaned it. I apologized too, though not for leaving. I told Arthur I was sorry for letting silence become a wall, even when parts of it were not required by duty. I had hidden behind classification sometimes because explaining the emotional truth felt harder than citing rules. I had let distance protect me from his disappointment, then resented him for not crossing it. He listened without seizing on my apology, as proof that his anger had been justified. That restraint was new. We were both proud, he said. Yes, I answered. But you were the parent. He nodded. I know. That was enough for that day. Caleb's apologies came differently. They arrived in fragments, often at inconvenient times. He apologized in a hardware store aisle for telling cousins I only cared about the house. He apologized in Arthur's driveway for using the phrase confused again, because he knew how much it frightened Rose. He apologized by mail for the affidavit, writing that he had counted on Arthur not reading it and on me being too hurt to challenge him gently. That one I kept in the file, not because I wanted ammunition, but because accountability recorded is harder to revise when shame fades. One evening, Caleb came to the Bay House with a box of old photographs he had found in his garage. He said, "I think Mom meant for you to have these." We spread them across the table. There I was at 12 holding Caleb on my hip while he reached for my ice cream. There we were in Halloween costumes, me as a pirate, Caleb as a ghost with eye holes too low. There was Rose at 30, laughing at something outside the frame. There was Arthur before age and stubbornness bent him, standing beside a half-built porch with a hammer in his hand. Caleb touched one picture of the two of us on bicycles. I don't remember us being happy, he said. We were, I replied. Not always, but enough. He nodded, and I realized jealousy had stolen happy memories from him too. Bitterness does not only distort the people you resent, it edits your own life until all roads lead back to injury. The county eventually closed part of the review with repayment orders and monitoring rather than criminal escalation. Some people in the family thought that was mercy. Others thought it was scandal avoided. I thought it was complicated. Caleb had done wrong. He had also begun cooperating before the process hardened further. Arthur did not want his son imprisoned in his final years, and Rose's letter, though fierce, had asked for truth more than vengeance. I had learned not to confuse maximum punishment with maximum healing. Still, every agreement had numbers. Every number had due dates. Mercy without structure is just another opportunity for manipulation. The first repayment check Caleb brought to Arthur was small, embarrassingly small, compared with the damage. Caleb placed it on the table and said, "It isn't enough." Arthur looked at the check, then at him. "No," he said. Caleb's face fell. Then Arthur added, "But it is a start." That distinction became the shape of their relationship. Not enough. A start. Not forgiven. Accountable. Not trusted. trying. Families survive when they do, by learning to live inside unfinished sentences. I visited Tom's grave that fall and told him the whole story. That may sound foolish to people who have never loved someone long after their body left. I stood with my hands in my coat pockets while leaves moved across the cemetery road and said, "You were right about visible blood." Then I told him about Caleb's laugh, Rose's recording, Arthur's salute. I imagined Tom's expression: jaw tight at Caleb, eyes soft at Rose, one eyebrow raised at my decision to represent myself. He would have said I was either brave or impossible, depending on how frightened he had been. Before I left, I placed a small stone on his marker and whispered, "I handled it." The wind off the water smelled like rain. Somewhere inside me, the part that had been waiting for his approval rested. When winter came, the bay turned pewter and the house creaked at night like an old ship. Arthur's visits became shorter because cold bothered his joints. Caleb drove him sometimes, and at first I watched Caleb's hands on the wheel, his tone when helping Dad out of the car, the speed with which he answered questions. Old vigilance does not retire quickly. One afternoon, Caleb noticed, "You're checking whether I'm managing him," he said. "Yes," he nodded. "Good." That single word did more for trust than any speech. A man who can accept being watched after breaking faith may eventually become safer. Not because suspicion is pleasant, but because he no longer treats consequences as insults. We spent Christmas at Arthur's house. It was the first Christmas after Rose's death, and none of us knew how to inhabit it. Caleb brought store-bought cookies and admitted they were store-bought before anyone praised them. Arthur gave me a framed copy of a photograph I had never seen. Rose at the bus station in 1979, watching me bored with my duffel bag. Arthur had taken it from a distance. In the photo, my mother's hand was raised to her mouth, and my younger self was turned halfway back, trying to smile. "You took this?" I asked. Arthur nodded. "I told myself I was photographing your mother." "Were you?" He swallowed. "No. I wanted proof you looked back." The room blurred again, not with pain exactly, but with the ache of discovering love hidden under decades of poor behavior. "I always looked back," I said. He nodded. "I know. Caleb gave me a gift too. It was a small wooden frame containing a copy of the peanut butter cookie recipe, the one that said he liked them soft and I liked them crisp. Under it, he had written in his own hand, "She knew both of us." I stared at it a long time. "Thank you," I said. He looked relieved, then ashamed of being relieved. Gifts between people rebuilding trust are never just gifts. They are questions. Can I offer this? Will you see a trap? Can we remember the same woman without fighting over her? That day, the answer was yes. Later that night, after Arthur went to bed and Caleb left, I stood alone in Rose's kitchen. The counters had been wiped clean. The new automatic payment folder sat by the phone, labeled in Arthur's blocky handwriting. On the refrigerator was a photograph of Rose, one of Caleb, one of me in uniform, and a newer one of all three of us standing stiffly by the bay because Arthur had insisted on using the camera timer and nearly fallen getting into place. It was not a perfect family display. It was evidence of effort. I touched the magnet holding my Navy photograph and thought of the hallway picture Caleb used to turn face down. This one remained upright. I have no illusion that everyone gets this kind of ending. Many families never reach truth. Many records are destroyed, many elders silenced, many daughters dismissed until the lie becomes inheritance. I was fortunate in ways that still make me angry. Fortunate Rose left evidence. Fortunate Claire remembered. Fortunate Ruth was willing. Fortunate Caleb used emails. Fortunate Mr. Keene had enough professional alarm to stop leaning into the lie. Fortunate Judge Porter listened carefully. Fortunate my training taught me not to react before building the timeline. Justice often depends on preparation, but it also depends on whether the world leaves you enough fragments to assemble. My mother left fragments. I assembled them. That is the simplest version of the story. The fuller version is messier. I wanted my father to defend me before evidence forced him. He did not. I wanted my brother to love our mother more than he feared failure. He did not. I wanted Rose to call me in daylight without whispering and say, "I need help." She could not. I wanted Tom beside me in that courtroom, one steady hand on my shoulder. He was gone. None of those wants were answered. What I received instead was truth late, justice partial, recognition imperfect, and enough love left in the ruins to build something smaller but real. At 63, I have learned that smaller and real is better than grand and false. When people hear this story, they often focus on the dramatic moments. They want to hear about the clearance question, Mr. Keene's face, the recording, the retainer, the realtor email, the salute. I understand. Those are the scenes with thunder in them. But the story turned on quieter acts. Rose hiding a USB drive behind a cake recipe, me paying taxes without announcing it, Claire remembering discomfort, Ruth telling the truth in a diner parking lot, Arthur reading a note in his dead wife's handwriting, Caleb bringing one small repayment check and admitting it was not enough. A life is rarely changed by one explosion. More often it changes because enough small truths gather in one place and refuse to move. That is why I tell the story now, not to make myself look clever. I have been clever and still lonely, not to make Caleb a monster. Monsters are easy to dismiss, and Caleb was more frightening because he was ordinary, insecure, indebted, resentful, persuasive, and convinced his pain entitled him to other people's lives. Not to make Arthur a villain. He was a proud old man who mistook control for love and regret for principle until regret finally won. I tell it because somebody listening may have a blue recipe box of their own, literal or otherwise. Somebody may be hearing careful questions from an elderly parent and dismissing them as anxiety. Somebody may be the absent child in a family that worships proximity while ignoring control. Somebody may be the quiet one everyone underestimates because they have not yet opened their folder. If that is you, listen to dates. Listen to the pauses before answers. Listen when a person who was never fearful begins asking whether normal things are normal. Keep receipts, not because love should require proof, but because manipulation thrives where love refuses documentation. Do not let shame stop you from checking public records. Do not let a loud relative define loyalty by who stands closest to the hospital bed. And when the time comes to speak, speak plainly. Truth does not need decoration. It needs order. I walked into that courtroom alone. Yes. I carried no attorney's briefcase, no entourage, no loud relatives ready to defend me. I carried a leather folder, a blue recipe box's secret, my mother's last faith in me, and 4 decades of training in the discipline of dates. I did not need to shout. I did not need to perform pain. I only needed to let the record speak clearly enough that even the people who had benefited from misunderstanding me could no longer pretend the lie was easier. And when my father finally saluted me, when Caleb finally told the truth without asking it to be called forgiveness, when Rose's letter rested safely beside Tom's photograph, I understood something. I wish I had known younger. Being unseen does not make you less real. Being misjudged does not make you what they say. Silence can be misread, but it can also be preparation. And sometimes, when the time is right, the quietest person in the room opens a folder and changes the story forever.